Thanks for this fascinating journey through different parts of the history of Brexit, including an outlook. What are the questions? Do you have any particular questions, any topic that you would still to be touched upon? I would be very interesting. Before I what do you think, how strong will be the re-entry movement once you're out? Or if there will be a re-entry movement?
Not for, okay, well, I promise to repeat the question for the camera. Will a re-entry movement emerge in the UK? I doubt it for a long time. It depends how Brexit turns out. If Brexit is widely viewed at some time in the reasonably close future to have been a failure, a disaster, if the economic performance of the UK outside the EU is bad and considerably worse than it was before, and its immediate neighbours' economic performance, then you might see it coming. But my gut feeling is that this buries the issue for quite some years.
Okay.
A question maybe in the same trends. It's about party loyalty, but without the Brexit aspect. Once Brexit is done, do you think that all Labour voters who now come for the Conservatives will return to Labour, or this might be the end of Labour, or will there be a new group come out of that?
So will the Labour Party revive? Will it collapse? I mean, we know from what is happening in the rest of Europe that parties which seemed permanent disappear or fade from the scene, and new parties can emerge. The British electoral system makes that a lot more difficult. I mean, a Macron doesn't just emerge in British politics. He needs a party behind him, and Italy the same. The political parties have different names and different compositions from what they used to have. Belgian political parties bear no resemblance really to the ones which existed when I arrived here in 1978. So there are changes over time. The genius of the British parties has been that they change while keeping their name and fundamental identity. So the Conservative Party is a very different animal from the one which won the election in 1951 or before the war. I mean, Churchill would find it hard to recognise, but it's still the Conservative Party. The Labour Party is different already from Tony Blair's party, which was very different from the party of Harold Wilson, whom I mentioned earlier, and so on. So they're quite good at surviving, these parties. They have very well-oiled machines on the ground throughout the country, local party structure. And the British electoral system is not proportional representation. It's based on constituencies. And with a relatively small swing in the vote from one to the other, you get a very different result. So who knows what the future brings? Mr. Johnson is aware of all of that, and he knows that these people are not instinctively loyal Conservatives, the ones who have changed party to vote for him this time, and he will try very hard in the next few years to bind them into his party by making policy decisions which respond to their needs or his understanding of their needs. So you will see a lot of effort made to invest in the infrastructure of Northern England. Less emphasis on London, the City of London. There are lots of graphs being produced in the newspapers now about how much money is spent per person on transport in the various regions of the country. London spends, or has spent on it, a lot more per person for transport than the northeast of England. Is that right? Is it fair? Johnson will say as a result of the election, I have to reorientate my policies to try and persuade the people who voted for us for the first time that they should vote for us again in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time. Will he succeed? Will he fail? I don't know. But that's what's at stake.
Yes, I believe that each civilization starts, right, and rises, goes through a peak, and then goes through a phase of decadence, right? And if we look at British since 1766, the Norman conquest, we can see that it has, a rise and then went through a peak in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and then went through a phase of decadence. My question is, isn't the fate of the United Kingdom to be just England and Wales with a reunited Ireland? We've been reading a lot about this, and it seems like this is where we're going, and an independent Scotland.
So the question is British civilization, which started in 1066, coming to an end? I wouldn't go that far. I agree with you that there is a lot of discussion now of Irish unification and Scottish independence, which have always been issues in politics, but are more prominent than I think in any time in my lifetime. But they're not foregone conclusions. Britain has been, at least England and Scotland have been together for a long time now, and there are many arguments of sentiment and identity in favour of keeping them together, just as there are nationalist forces pushing the other way. There are also very practical problems which would have to be addressed in any campaign about Scottish independence. What money would be used in Scotland? How would the border between England and Scotland be managed? If Scotland joined the European Union, and that's the stated policy of the Scottish National Party, all the problems we just talked about with the Irish border would be at the Anglo-Scottish border, which would also be a border between the EU and a foreign country. And yet, again, a border which has been open for centuries. People are used to going backwards and forwards, family ties on either side, not a natural border. It would not be a very easy thing to organise at all. So I'm not a prophet. I'm not going to predict the future. The United Kingdom is a pretty resilient political body. It is under strain. It will be under strain in the coming period. I don't know how it'll work out. Personally, I would regret it if what I think of as my country, and I think of Edinburgh as much as part of my country as London and Cardiff. Northern Ireland is different. Northern Ireland is a recent addition to the United Kingdom for a specific purpose, and there is less, I think, sentimental attachment in Great Britain. Great Britain is the big triangle, Scotland, England and Wales, to Northern Ireland, at least in England, than in other parts of the country. So I think it will come under strain, but just as this wonderful country we are sitting in has shown itself to be remarkably resilient and pretty smart in solving its problems, I think it is more likely than not that the UK will endure. It's very hard to change because the big parties in power or hoping to be in power next time using it really have no interest in changing it. It's turkeys voting for Christmas. If you benefit from it, why would you vote to change it? It is obviously in some respects unfair because many votes are simply wasted. If you live, as many people do, in a constituency which is safe for one of the big parties, then if you vote for a small party, you are not being heard. And if you vote for the one that is almost certain to lose, you know that you're not going to win anyway. So unless, and there was an opportunity recently, unless there is a coalition between a big party and a small one, in which the small one says it is a condition of my joining the coalition that we change the electoral system, I don't see it happening. There was, before 2015, there was a coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberals, Liberal Democrats, and the Liberal Democrats have traditionally been in favour of proportional representation, but they didn't make it an absolute condition of joining the coalition. What they did have was a referendum, which they lost, on a different electoral system, not pure proportional representation, but an alternative vote system where you would give a set of preferences. The UKIP party, which has no MPs, but in a way has been the most successful party in modern British politics because it used to be a very small fringe group talking about Brexit, and look what happened. The Brexit Party, it then became the Brexit Party, it's now the Reform Party. Now, I don't know how strong it is going to be in the coming years, but it is talking about proportional representation, getting rid of the House of Lords, an upheaval in the British constitutional system. It may one day be in a position to achieve that. What the Conservatives, small c Conservatives who think the Constitution is fine, say, well, look, we went through 3 years of hell, but the system still works. We had an election, one party won it, the two big parties are still dominant. That's what the British system is supposed to do. And now we'll get on with it. Well, we'll see what getting on with it means, because the next comes down to Brexit, really. If Brexit is achieved in a relatively smooth way, people will say the system worked. So,
how can the Good Friday Agreement can be respected and UK can leave the customs union and the single market at the same time?
We need some Belgian plumbers for that. It's logically very difficult to do, and it requires a lot of goodwill and cooperation on all sides to make it work. The agreement which Johnson reached with the Europeans at the end of last year, a couple of months ago before the election, and which is about to be approved by the House of Commons, says that Northern Ireland remains in the United Kingdom customs territory, but has no customs differences with the Republic of Ireland. And that Northern Ireland remains aligned on EU legislation in respect of traded goods and services. So EU law or something like it will continue to be applied in Northern Ireland, but not in Great Britain. Let's say the UK has a trade agreement with a foreign country, which is different from the EU's, the US, obvious example. The UK has a trade agreement with the US, which has different import tariffs from the EU-US arrangement, or allows goods in which the EU won't. So the famous examples given are always chlorinated chicken. The Americans apparently, before chickens are sold on their market, they give them a bath in some chlorine solution, which is no doubt very hygienic, but the Europeans complain about it. So we in the EU today don't import chicken from the United States. Nor do we import foodstuffs with genetically modified organisms. The UK might have an agreement with the Americans that we don't mind GMOs, we don't mind your chicken. We all eat chicken in the US when we go there. We don't come back with horns. GMO, we think the science is okay. So you might get serious differences of opinion about what should regulate, how you should regulate goods and services. If those goods come into Great Britain, then they are legally saleable in Northern Ireland as well, and then there is no border for them to get into Ireland, and then there is no border for them to be sent over to Belgium. So the fear is that we living here in Belgium might end up, we eat some chicken sandwich, and it comes from a chicken which was imported by the British from the US and was chlorinated after, is it before or after slaughter? I don't know. Anyway, somehow, is it after slaughter? Okay. Americans, any Americans here? I'm not denigrating your chicken. I'm sure you have very fine chicken, but these are genuine friendly differences about how to regulate things. There are other less friendly ones where we have strongly opposed views. So the question is, how are you going to deal with that? Frankly, there is no real answer. The one answer is there would have to be checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland in the Irish Sea, which, nobody talks about it very much, already happens. Because, ladies and gentlemen, for animal and plant health purposes, Ireland is a jurisdiction. And livestock, so live animals and plants are traded around Ireland, but if they go across the Irish Sea into Great Britain, they are checked, and some of them are not allowed in because they have different diseases, only a few kilometers away. Similarly, any Spanish friends here? The Canary Islands are geographically Africa, obviously. They're just off the coast of Africa. But they are politically, legally part of Spain. But they have different animal and plant diseases there. So when animals and plants go from the Canary Islands to Spain or the other, or mainland Spain the other way around, they get checked. Nobody thinks that's a violation of Spanish sovereignty. The British have been doing this without talking about it very much. But if you say politically there are checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the unionist community in Northern Ireland, this is another example of separation and pushing us into the arms of the Irish. So you have to be careful. So they will have to be careful. There will have to be some discrete controls, and they'll have to be pragmatic about it. But Ireland works because today, since the Good Friday Agreement, because the Irish and Northern Irish and British and European authorities all want to make it work. It's complicated. It's not always 100% application of the law as it's written down. It's a pragmatic interpretation of the law. But if you want the system to work, you have to do it. Any more questions?
I would still have a question, because you mentioned the Union and United Kingdom, Great Britain. There was a very famous poll before the elections showing that the Tory members who voted Boris Johnson into office before the general elections, they prefer Brexit to the unity of the United Kingdom. I mean, what to make out of this? I mean, is this true? Is it a true belief? Is it kind of a, I mean, is the members, do they care so much more about the... Or?
I don't know how... So how... there was an opinion poll saying that Conservative Party members thought Brexit was more important than the unity of the country. They were prepared to lose Scotland to leave the EU. I don't know how scientific that opinion poll was. What has happened, but I've seen it happen here too, in a way, is that because Scotland has its own political institutions, its own political parties, the countries have diverged. If you take the front page of The Scotsman, which is a big Scottish daily newspaper, and The Times in London, you will see differences. There are different preoccupations, different agendas. Just as in this country, if you take a big Flemish newspaper and a big Francophone newspaper, you see different agendas, different politics, different preoccupations, because the institutions are different, and their agendas are different, their schedules are different, their political makeup is different. So once you start a process of decentralization, you inevitably end up with different political agendas in different places. The problem in the UK is, and this is part of what is happening, is that England is nowhere. One reading of Brexit is this is English nationalism, which has no outlet. What does England have? It has a football team. Not a bad football team, actually. So we do sport differently. Some sports, and sport is very odd in my country. Soccer is 4 different home nations. So England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland all have completely separate leagues and national football teams. Rugby union is England, Scotland, Wales, and all of Ireland. For rugby union, so 15 players, Ireland is one thing. Belfast, Dublin, religion, doesn't matter. If you're Irish, you're Irish. Northern, Southern, you can play rugby for Ireland. Rugby league, which is a different game, 13, similar but different, no Ireland, it's Northern Ireland and the Republic separately. So and the captain of one of the England cricket teams is an Irishman. So we're very weird on sport. But sport is one of the English things. It brings England together. What else brings England together which is not British? Not very much, to be honest. The English are used to dominating the UK, so they sort of think it's all England somehow. And yet, for the last 20, 30 years, before their eyes, it has changed. Scotland is different. It's more self-confident, has its own agenda, has its own politics. Ireland, they are discovering, is a very different place in many ways, barely understood, different political parties, huge preoccupation with identity and religion, which the English don't have. So one theory of Brexit for political scientists is that this was a response of England to its sense of alienation in the modern world. It's lost its empire, it hasn't even won the World Cup since 1966, and it's losing its identity within the UK, and meanwhile, people from Brussels are telling it what to do. That's part of it. Now, and that comes out in that opinion poll, I'm sure, somewhere. Who knows how important it is? But lots of people already today are saying that England should have a parliament. One theory is that the Houses of Parliament, with the Big Ben, you've all seen it, no doubt, are in desperate need of rebuilding. Apparently the wiring is awful, there are floods in the basement, it's very dangerous. So they're going to have to take a big decision about moving people out, the members of Parliament, and rebuilding it. Most people think they should move out next door somewhere in central London. A more radical approach is to say no. They should move to somewhere in the middle of England or in the north of England, Manchester, York, Leeds, somewhere else. And they should go back to Westminster as the British Parliament. But whatever they left behind, perhaps a new building in Manchester, Leeds or Sheffield or York or somewhere, that should become the English Parliament. There should be an English government. There should be English elections. Maybe. I don't know. It's a bit like Canada. Canadians here? Good. I haven't put my foot in it much yet. Canada is always a complicated confederation because you've got a big English-speaking majority and a smaller French-speaking minority. The UK is a bit like that too. England dominates the country because of its size and population. All the main institutions are in London, which is the capital of both. And so it has institutions which have emerged from a very different historical period and not interrupted. We didn't have a revolution. We didn't have a year zero. We didn't rebuild in 1945. We didn't have to deal with the problems of collaboration and resistance because we weren't occupied. So the British have a sense, the English have a sense of a sort of continuous history which the Germans don't have. I don't think the French have because they think in terms of their successive republics. And 1945 for many European countries, for most European countries, was a re-beginning. Whereas in the UK, amazingly, when you think about British political history, Churchill, the super uber hero of the war, what happened in 1945? They threw him out. They wanted a Labour government. And his deputy, the quiet Mr. Attlee, who had been his loyal number 2 throughout the war, won the election. National Health Service, nationalisation, on a big Labour agenda. So the UK has a notion, you're right, 1066. I mean, I hope it's more sophisticated in the way it's taught in schools, but there is a sort of comic book folklore history which starts in 1066, and then you have lots of kings and queens, and you end up with everybody watching The Crown on television. It's obviously more complicated than that, but there's that sense in it. Whereas I think most European countries think about their histories differently and have to factor in the war and all the tragedy and compromises and scandals that, you Belgians know about. It's still bubbling around in Belgian politics.
Okay, many thanks. I think we have come to the end of time already. Thanks again for coming to us, for sharing your expertise and view on this fascinating Brexit process. I think you deserve another round of big applause.